Thank you, Anastasia. First, as I said this morning, I'm awfully sorry not to be with you. And of course, it's much better that the presenters are in there, but unfortunately, I got a toothache and headache yesterday, and I have some kind of infection, but now I'm full of painkillers. I hope it will, I will manage. Anyway, the topic of the third session is very similar to the one of overall topic. So of course, we will come into a few issues that we already touched upon. Sorry, I'm awfully sorry not to be with you in person. And of course, it's much better that the presenters are in the room, but unfortunately I got a toothache yesterday and I have some kind of infection. So, but my body is full of painkillers. I hope I could do a little bit of justice. Anyway, the topic of the third session here is very similar to the overall topic. So it will be some overlap. And of course, we've touched upon several issues already in this domain, but at least I prepared some slides to try to go a little bit deeper into the connection between coastal shipping and land modes. Can you see the next slide now?
Yes.
Good. So these are the topics that were lined out by Olaf here. So I will come back to this one, and I assume that you have read this and prepared for this from the description of the roundtable. What I will focus on is the empirical focus will be on Northern Europe, and it will be on ro-ro and road-pax shipping. As I would say, the characteristic, at least when it comes to unitized goods, the characteristic segments when it comes to coastal shipping. My focus is mostly connections to land modes, and I will do some comparison with the container hinterland that in many terms has been rather successful, where it's rather infant stage of combining ro-ro and road-pax shipping with the rail, for instance. Talk a little bit about trends and the different measures to strengthening short sea liner shipping, and particularly in combination with land modes. I'll touch briefly upon small ports dilemma, because in the ro-ro road-pax segment, there are often different and smaller ports involved than the container ports and the break bulk or the bulk ports. I'll touch also a bit about costs as part of the theme here, but not go into detail. I hope others could contribute that during the discussion. And I will finalize with a little bit of available technologies for rail transport of trucks and semi-trailers. Anyway, if you look to previous roundtable reports, we can see from the topics here that it's much about container shipping, and also the content is very much about container shipping. Also some more on the intermodal, multimodal scene, and rail transport. If you go through them, I checked for container versus semi-trailer, and it was briefly factor 10 in number of appearances. So very much of the discussion is about containerized transport. I have had much use of this rather old report from 2001, but it's since I do short sea shipping research, I think this one has been very useful, and I've cited it several times. But still, there is not much about container and rather little about ro-ro and road-pax. And if in any media or any presentation, if we want to illustrate foreign trade, and particularly in Sweden, which roughly, I think, at least more than half of our GDP is related to import and export. So there, of course, big attention on trade, and we often illustrate it with a container port. And we have had success in Gothenburg when it comes to Hinterland shuttles, but this is the container segment. But you can see it's roughly 25 shuttles, also rather short distances they have been able to capture. And roughly 60% of the containers come or go to the port via rail transport. Another success story has been the competition. As you can see to the right here, there are several providers of these shuttles, so it's not a monopoly. So it is the EU who wants to foster competition on rail has lifted up this example as a successful story. But if we look into the port statistics in Sweden, we find that much more goods is rolling over the quay than is lifted. You can see here that more than 3 times the flow of semi-trailers and trucks compared to containers and cassettes. And also some parts of this forest and steel products is also moving by ro-ro. But they are instead categorized as the products rather than the load unit. And of course, we have liquid and dry bulk composing roughly half of the flows. Similar situation in the UK ports, but as I said, very little attention to ro-ro. Me and my colleague Erika Bergqvist, we did a study roughly 10 years ago on the differences, because we are not that naive to say that we think that it's been successful in container segment and now we just copy that for semi-trailer. Because as we all know around the table is that the geographic transport market is quite different. And I often tell my students, if you see a container, it's most probably goods that relates to another continent, whereas it's a semi-trailer, it would be kept inside the EU. We have different modal competition. The business priority or operational priorities, economies of scale, often in containerized shipping when it comes to fill containers well and fill the ships well. Whereas in the ro-ro segment, it's often customer convenience, or we try to, we tend to compromise a bit of the efficiency in the rail to prioritize port efficiency instead. Port geography, few large hub ports and feeder ports in container segment, whereas there are many small ports, and particularly for bridge substitutes in small cities and so on, it's more geographical than the that you have to go to a big city where you have a big local demand. Port of Gothenburg often also shows themselves as a container port because there's substantial work content, more costly to, whereas in semi-trailer segment, it's much more limited. And often if it's road pack, it's of course also even done by the truck drivers themselves. Hinterland is deep, whereas it's shallow for ro-ro, and it could be very deep or not even called a hinterland for some of the bridge substitutes. So if you go from, say, Budapest to Manchester and you use Dover-Calais, you rarely would call the ride from Budapest to Calais a hinterland transport. Then shipping is more a supplier or subcontractor. Rather fast in both, but in ro-ro particularly, depending on the turnarounds and so on, we see very different speeds being utilized. And touching upon the last presentations, we have an island Gotland where they use ferries in roughly 30 knots, which of course consumes a lot of carbon fuel and emits a lot. But there it's extremely fast, whereas others, particularly pure ro-ro, go much slower. Precision, the container ship arrives on a Tuesday, the ro-ro ship 8 o'clock possibly, and if it's a bridge substitute ferry, it could be 8:15. So big difference in the precision. Order time, in that I mean how much time in before you have to order to be sure to have a slot. And of course now during the pandemic it has been very tough in container, but a normal year at this time of the year you would have made the booking about a month ago, because now it's the peak of the season to send for Christmas sales. Whereas in ro-ro, particularly bridge substitute ferries, we more or less just line up in the port and take the next departure. Frequencies are also different, and a little bit old figures here, but we heard from Mike before that we've seen significantly bigger ships coming up both in container and the ro-ro segments. The ones coordinating, it's often the shipping line or line agent or specific sea forwarder when it comes to container, whereas the normal, say, shippers themselves or road hauliers that just use a ferry or might be a normal forwarder. But as we'll see later on in the presentation here, the shipping lines take more actions now to integrate and also offer hinterland transport. Dwell time for both the cargo and the units is different. The container itself is a rather cheap unit, and the goods has been on the move for, say, 7 weeks or so, if you talk Asia-Europe relations. So that can sort of stand a little bit of weight in the port, a little bit of weight at the end consumer or the warehouse it goes to. Whereas you have much more controlled turnover when it comes to semi-trailer and of course trucks, which are more costly units. Rail technology is very simple when it comes to containers, but very complicated when it comes and costly when it comes to semi-trailers. And the same goes for the transshipment technology, where the semi-trailer is very much setting the standards. How big trains do we need? What types of transshipments are possible? Whereas it could be automated rather simply in the container segment. But on the other hand, when it comes to the end customer, it's much easier to deliver a semi-trailer. You just take the tractor away and then it's there. Whereas you have problems to unload a container. If you want to read more, this is the paper me and Rikard wrote. So what trends do we see now in the Ro-Ro pack segments? Well, they're more focused on freight. A company like Stena Line, some 10 years back, they said they were a sort of experience company, and they offered leisure packages and so on. But rather rapidly, they have seen the share of the revenue coming from freight has increased a lot, and particularly with the pandemic, it has been useful for them because they still have revenues. Those shipping lines to the east of Sweden, more dependent on passengers, have suffered much more. We see vertical integration, as like in the container segment. Stena has bought forwarders, which in turn has bought hauliers, and we see the same for other big Ro-Ro shipping lines, that they want to integrate and offer door-to-door transport. They also integrate without buying firms with the rail, together with intermodal operators. They could build up a network. We'll come back to that. As Mike was telling, we see larger vessels, and that often implies a bit longer routes, because a longer time stays in port. A bigger ship needs more time in port with the bigger volumes. And it also means, with the longer routes and so on, more unaccompanied and also intermodal transport. So a trend towards more advanced transport chains, I would say, and more use of shipping. We also see, I can see an increase in containers, and particularly now during the pandemic, where you can see to the picture to the right with the Wallenius Sul, which is intended mostly to be a Ro-Ro ship, but you can see the amount of containers on board there. So both DFDS and Stena Line, two of the big players here now, more offer their services integrated with sea and rail transport. And then, of course, particularly in the right picture here, you can see that there would be possibilities to go to, say, southern France or Italy by ship all the way around. But the combination is, of course, much faster. And you might see it at the option would be to still go by the red ferries and Ro-Ro lines here, and then truck over the continent. So it's a bit forward at least. Cobble Freight or CLDN, they have been even more active, I would say, integrating, offering logistics services. And they have also a map showing particularly the routes to Italy and Germany here. They offer a combination of shipping and rail services. This is another type of service connecting mostly the forest industry in the far north, but we also have other industries coming up, with Northvolt building a battery factory in Skellefteå. We have 2 examples of fossil-free steel being produced. It's a lot. I think it's 100 billion euros is being invested in if it was, or 10 billion euros are invested in the north of Sweden for new manufacturing, and it will be mostly Ro-Ro shipping taking the products out. And these are big mills, often at port with private ports, but in Tilburg, Zeebrugge, and Antwerp, and Travemünde, there will probably be connections with rail for this low cost or low value products that are produced by the forest industry. Some years back, you can see Anastasia, you're on here as a co-author. This is in Swedish, but it's basically about the idea of not choosing bridge substitute, but use a little bit longer routes to go around the coast and go closer to where the goods is actually going or coming from. We used the previous study with truck drivers because particularly with the bridge substitutes, it's difficult to know where the goods is actually going. So you more or less have to, or at least a good way of categorizing this is to interview truck drivers in the ports. And also we did interviews and a short mail survey. And here you can see the situation today is much the one to the left here. We have big bridge substitutes coming to Trelleborg, also to Gothenburg, a little bit to the east, whereas much of the goods is going to the middle of Sweden, or at least warehouses here distributing to the rest of Sweden. So there could be options to come closer. We also investigated the potential for a hub, as we talked, Lourdes talked about before, in the Canary Islands. I'm not really convinced here, but we need to investigate because the study was mostly funded by the region, Skåne here in the far south. And of course, Port of Trelleborg as part of the region, they saw a potential threat that goods will come around the port and use other ones. So what did we see? We saw no really physical technical barriers. There was capacity in the ports, but it was difficult. It's difficult to change with this. It was within 350 kilometers because it is a change, and we heard before that it's possibly not 30% less cost, but at least you really have to have the benefits to make them change. And if it's just the 350 kilometer road haulage in Sweden, it's a rather stable situation. We see issues in competition. When it comes to costs, we have fairway dues, port fees, and particularly pilot fees that often kill the calculus. But if it's normal ferries and so on, then the crew on board don't need pilots. They are exempted for that. On the positive side, the truck driver shortage and unaccompanied has got a boost, partly because we simply don't want to use truck drivers driving long distances, and they tend to want to sleep at home, as was said earlier today. Frequencies have to be dealt with, and also the reliability and the trust that has also been touched upon before. Environment, climate aspects, and connected to the last point here, this wasn't much discussed when we did this study, but now when we think that we could electrify shorter routes, it might in fact not be obvious that we should go longer routes if they are fossil fuel driven and the shorter ones are electrical driven, and particularly if the trucks or if it's combined with electric trains. Unbalanced goods flow is always a nightmare for logisticians, and not least here, that you tend to use different routes going in and out. And if the ports could do more, possibly not the infrastructure close to these ports that would have massively larger flows that are not prepared for that. And one major issue was also that much that is trucked is food from continental Europe, and the logistic structure is that they first touch in a warehouse in southern Sweden and then distribute it. And of course, that will be problematic if you then end up north of that warehouse structure. We saw some actions that are needed from the commercial stakeholders. They need to cooperate more. That's typically what all master students say, just share all information and everyone is happy. And of course, there are limits how much you can cooperate, but the different stakeholders in the chain can, of course, cooperate more than they do today. Timetables need to be adjusted, and also the knowledge barrier, which is often between shippers and transport providers, that we cannot do much more. And when it comes to policies, simplify the rules and regulations, lower fairway and port use. If you want to subsidize something, possibly you should be rather specific to do that for the transshipment. And we could use more of eco bonus, which is a support system for building up new. It's a bit like what we had before with Marco Polo and Motorways of the Seas. that we want to promote new services, but it's difficult to get profitable the first years. We have also diminishing differences between domestic and international, and that comes from rules, regulations with the fuel taxes and so on. And on the other way, we could increase the taxation for trucks, road user fees, and limit the track speed, but that was not very popular among shippers, because that will tend to make logistics worse rather than promote something that is better. But we have a few routes. The one to the east here with Nynäshamn-Gdansk is a very old one. Actually, an uncle of mine used that in the 1980s when he lived in Stockholm but worked in Poland. And once he overslept at the stop here in Gdansk, so when he woke up, he was up north again, so he had to spend 2 more days. So that's not good. Stena Line, Gothenburg, Kiel is also an old route, and for each, like the SECA, and for each thing that has happened in shipping, I was fearful that they will cancel that route, but nowadays it's rather good. And one of the main reasons is that actually that the shippers or the forwarders, they want to use the rail services out of Gothenburg, and they want to avoid a more congested area in the south. There's a new route as well between Nynäshamn and Rostock, and that has got eco-bonus support. But so far, unfortunately, has been, I would say, it's even been in the media that it's unsuccessful. And some say it's the timing, some say that it takes time to change logistics. I'm not really sure we're going to investigate that, but so far, unfortunately, has not been successful. And when we did this study, me and Richard Bergqvist, we had a situation 10 years ago when we had very distributed logistics structure in the port of Gothenburg. So we had the main container handling is here, APM terminals, main ro-ro is here, but we also have Stena Line to Germany here and to Denmark here. And the intermodal domestic terminal was here in the city center, which made it difficult to create trains, a lot of internal movements in the city. But we also had some on-dock rail in the container terminal, in the ro-ro terminal, and also a small terminal outside the gates here, connecting the local businesses. Because up here somewhere we have the big Volvo plant, Volvo Cars plant, and a bit north of here is the Volvo Trucks plant, and they have, of course, a lot of incoming components and so on that uses the port. And they put car and truck export is here. So the problems we saw then was that there was a tradition, and of course it's easy to just contract a haulier and they deal with the ferry crossings and so on. Now you have to pick together different transport services, and you need hands-on planning with the rail service, port service, and the shipping. And you had some, at least in the short run, problems with semi-trailers lacking lift pockets, but that of course is often a leasing market, so you could lease semi-trailers with the lift pockets instead to be able to get onto rail. But the dispersed berths was a problem, and rail capacity was the port uses it, but also the Volvo companies and other, the energy port and so on uses this congested rail service or the infrastructure. And we had a rather short road haulage distances, and of course intermodal transport is more beneficial the longer the distance it is. And this is the situation now. So we have moved the domestic terminal. So it's here now. You can see the picture up here. That it's a conventional intermodal terminal. You don't have to use the port to use it. It's outside the gates. And it's been rather successful. So the domestic services are now concentrated here. Of course, the domestic flows that goes through has to go through the city if it's not port related. But that's still we have a lot of trains. The port access route is now double track, most of it. It's been invested and also electrified. So that has been better. And in 2027, the Stena terminals will move into this port. And then we have quite another situation with concentrated ro-ro services in the port, outer port area, and rail services to that. So it looks at least bright for the connection in Gothenburg to connect the sea and rail transport also for semi-trailers. A few words on the small ports dilemma. So we often in port research and so on, we talk about the container terminals, the main gateways when it comes to raw materials and so on, but we often neglect or miss the smaller municipality ports that are used for particularly the bridge substitutes. And they are often depending on one or a few shipping lines that service that, and you tend not want to have, sometimes not have to, because they bridge substitutes, they could be too fierce competition. It's better sometimes with one good service than two inferior ones. But particularly the staff in these small ports, they are often middle-aged men, 5 of them typically, and one day they should integrate with the new information as an information hub, and next day is in alternative fuels and the new regulations, and they sometimes feel very confused. And I put just this quote from International Association of Ports and Harbors and World Bank. This tend not to be the language, often men of the practice that deal with these ports. So, and they have limited time or capacity for research participation and access research, since they need to cover a very wide range of professions, more or less, or expertise, which make them also very vulnerable because they get so dependent on the shipping lines, technology suppliers, but also consultants helping them for different aspects. So we have put up a project here we call eHAM that helps them. They get a community, can learn from each other, and if there are studies we can test in one port, and then we could roll it out in the other ports, so at least they can learn from each other. Very short on costs. We have this traditional, this is a little bit more complicated than it has to be, but the same with rail and shipping, that we have costs and time consumption in the ports or the terminals. And on the long run, at least cost-wise, we're supposed to get some of it back due to the lower on the way cost with rail and shipping. But particularly in short sea shipping, much depends on who has the shortcut. If it's road, it's very competitive. If it's shipping that can go across the sea instead of around, then there's a benefit. But we also have some support schemes in place. We have, which is rarely discussed actually, another fuel and energy taxes, and no VAT paid for the fuel, which is a big advantage, of course, compared to much of trucking. But we should keep in mind that trucking also pays for their infrastructure through fuel taxes, so it's not really comparable. In Sweden, we have a net salary rule that says that the shipping lines, if you go to the Stena ferry in the morning after I left the kids in kindergarten, and you work there, and then you go back and sleep at home, you pay your taxes, and the shipping line pays the social cost, but they get refunded exactly the same sum. So it's a net salary system in Sweden, which is, of course, a rather strong subvention, particularly to the RoPax ferries with a lot of staff on board. And of course, we're part of the EU subvention schemes, Marco Polo, going back in time, the Motorways of the Seas, the Trans-European Network for transport, and more lately, a Swedish system for eco-bonus. And finally, a few words on technology, because as I started out with here, it's more complicated with semi-trailers. This is called Modalor. It's rather old technology to swing out a wagon, and you can back up a semi-trailer and then swing in and move again. Looks a little bit like this is a terminal. It's actually been used rather much between Italy and France. And it's not just to cope with an energy crisis now with all these tank trailers, but in fact it's confined or limited to tank trailers because of the shape of the tunnels between France and Italy. But the technology itself is not limited to tank trailers. Another attempt here is to have an interface in between, so you back up the semi-trailer onto a lift pocket, so you can either lift it You can see the lift pockets here, the conventional wagon or partly extended wagon, or you can horizontally move it, as you can see here. And you can see it perhaps better on this picture. We have a Swedish invention called the flexi wagon. Personally, I think it's possibly a little bit too expensive and heavy, and it's for full truck, also good for full trucks. But I think if you bring the engine and the driver with you, you have done something wrong, at least for longer distances. This is like the same technology we saw first. And this is another, didn't come that far, this development, but more lifting it up in the wagons. And we have had several concepts being presented over the years. And this is even more complicated. But I leave it with that. If you want some reading suggestions, they are here. They were not in the version that was sent out. I will send a new one, but I did some minor changes on that one. So these are what to discuss during this session. Thank you.